name's Ted, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of Building the Thunder, a series sponsored by Dynojet on upgrading my 2009 Harley Davidson Ultra Classic that you see right here. So far we've done a couple of videos where we've done an introduction to the series and explained some of the motivations and background behind why I'm doing these upgrades and how Dynojet's helping. We've also done some unboxing videos to show you some details about the parts that we're going to be putting on the motorcycle. Today's when we get to do what, for me anyway, is the most exciting part of it, where we're actually going to be taking all the old parts off and putting the new ones on. So you're going to be seeing some of what goes into this, maybe help get an idea of whether or not this is a job that you would want to tackle yourself on your motorcycle. As you can see, I've done a few things already to kind of get set up and started. I've got the bike set up in the area where I'm going to be working on it. I've taken the seat off, I've taken the saddlebags off, and I've gotten some of my tools laid out. For the most part, if you have standard tools in your garage, including wrenches, sockets, extensions, you're going to have most of what you need already. It's important to note that there are a lot of fasteners on these Harleys that have Allen head fasteners, like the air cleaner here and even the oil drain. So if you do any of your own work on these motorcycles, you probably have some Allen head sockets already, but if you don't, then you're going to need to get some. A couple of more specialty tools that you might not have if you haven't done a project like this before are going to be a torque wrench, some feeler gauges, a piston ring expander, and a piston ring filing tool. Another thing that's recommended is to have a piston ring compressor, and I'm not going to be using that myself, and I'll also point out that having the piston ring expander is considered optional, but beneficial. For me, the piston ring expander tool is going to be really helpful because when we put the rings on the pistons themselves, you can kind of roll them on and roll them around, but that does have the potential for scratching them or scratching the pistons. It's really just a matter of personal preference. Some people find that when they use the expander tools that they're more likely to break the piston rings. That's certainly a risk, but I find that they work out pretty well, and whenever I've tried rolling piston rings on, I usually find that it ends up resulting in a scratch, so that's what I prefer. But meanwhile, when you're putting the cylinders onto the piston assembly, and keep in mind, these cylinders are going to come down onto the piston and connecting rod assembly, which you're already going to have put together and attached to the motor. Because of how that arrangement works out, a standard piston ring compressor, like what you would use on a normal water-cooled engine, where you're feeding the piston and connecting rod assembly through the top, won't really work because you need to have a way of getting it out around the bottom. Now, I think I mentioned in a previous video that I have a good amount of experience with piston aircraft engines, and on those we would use a specific piston ring compressor that had a hole in the side to go around the connecting rod after you push the cylinder assembly on. I couldn't find anything like that was specific for the sizes needed for a Harley. It doesn't mean they don't exist; they probably do. But for that, I think I'm going to be just fine with putting in the little, just basically compressing the rings by hand and putting them on. So, and then the filing tool. This is important because when you put your piston rings in, you need to make sure that they're not too tight and not too loose for the end gap. If they're too tight, then they'll interfere and then they'll crack. If they're too loose, then you're going to have a lot of blow-by. But one of the steps that you need to do before assembly is to put the piston rings in the cylinder bores and check what that clearance is. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. But these are some of the tools that you're going to need. If I come across anything else during the video, I'll make sure to point that out. So like I said, I've already got the bike set up, and I've got the oil draining on it. So what we're going to do first is we're going to go ahead and we're going to start by taking off some of the exterior parts that we need. That's going to include taking the exhaust off, taking the air intake off, taking the fuel tank off, and then by the time we get that done, we'll have the engine pretty much exposed and get to start working on that. Another thing that's going to be really useful to have if you don't have it is the Harley Davidson manual. That's going to tell you how Harley recommends that you take the bike apart and get to all these components that you're going to be changing out. While some would say that it's not necessarily required, it certainly is going to help make sure that you have correct torque specs for everything. And for some of these things, if you have questions, it's always a good idea to have the manual. So with that, let's get to work. I thought I'd pause for a minute here and kind of show you where things are and some of the stuff I've done with a few tips. So as you can see, I've got the bike pretty close to ready to start taking the cylinders off. I've only been working about hour to hour and a half so far. So it gives you an idea of how quickly this goes, and I've never done this before, so I'm definitely not working as fast as I could. So you saw in the time lapse, basically what I did was I started off by taking the exhaust off, and I took it off in 4 pieces. The mufflers on this side and the other side. There's a crossover pipe that goes underneath the motorcycle, and then the Y pipe over here. I was able to just take off from the 2 cylinders as a single piece. I actually wouldn't have thought to do that. I need to give Joe at Powerhouse Dyno the credit for that, because he told me that you can do that. When I put the new exhaust back on, then certainly I'll be doing it a little bit differently, but this worked out really well. If you think about it, when you're taking the stuff off, you don't need to take it apart into all the individual little pieces. You can just, you probably don't want to destroy it, but you can be a little bit more efficient with how you take the parts off. So aside from having the nuts at each cylinder, and then you got the couple of bolts back here for each muffler, then you've got a mount here for the crossover, and a mount here, kind of where the 2 parts of the Y come together. One thing that I forgot to mention when I was listing out the tools that you need are a good assortment of Torx bits. So far, the only Torx bits I found are for my air cleaner. Now keep in mind that this was an aftermarket air cleaner, or an upgraded air cleaner rather, as part of the stage 1 upgrade that I had done previously. But it was a genuine Harley part, and it had Torx bits on it. I hate Torx. I think Allen heads are a whole lot better if you're going to do anything of that sort, but for some reason they put Torx there. So make sure that you got the Torx bits as well, or you're going to be frustrated. I'd actually forgotten I had this really complete kit over here for a little while, so I was trying to find the right bit that I otherwise didn't have. So good thing I remembered. When taking the exhaust off, you also are going to need to unbolt your footboard and at least swing it out of the way, kind of like what I did over here. Taking the fuel tank off, this is really very simple. There's a single bolt that goes up on the top right here, and then once you take that off, and then this bolt down here, you can swing the cover out of the way. The fuel tank is then held on by 4 bolts, 1, 2, 3, and then a 4th one on the other side. I'm gonna walk over here and I'm gonna show you on the fuel tank how you disconnect the fuel line. Moto Guzzi. That's my wife's Harley. So down over here, there's this quick disconnect, and this you just pull up on it with a couple of with 2 fingers, and then you pull the fuel line out from the bottom. I gotta say, this is really quite simple so far. I'm used to working on a lot of cars where sometimes it's simple, sometimes it's not. This is a really well done, easy to work on bike from what I'm seeing so far. Another tip I'll make is figure out a way to organize the parts that you take off of the bike as well as your hardware so that you don't lose it. A lot of this stuff you're going to need when you put it back together. So I've just got a box over here and keeping the air cleaner and some of the other parts together. So walk back over to the bike. So you can also see I've got all of the connectors, all the electrical connectors taken off. There's a couple of connectors for the oxygen sensors, which I'm going to plan to reuse, and then connections for the throttle body assembly, which includes the throttle butterfly valve. Remember, this is an electronic throttle body, so this is all electronically controlled. I believe that's going to be your manifold pressure sensor. You got your two fuel injectors over there, and then on the other side you've got your cylinder head temperature sensor right down here. I've taken a glove and put it over the fuel line with a zip tie to just try to keep debris out. Always a good practice. The last thing you want is debris in your fuel system. So the next thing I'm going to be doing is taking out the 4 Allen head screws to get the little intake manifold off, and then I think we should be ready to start getting the heads off. Let's get back to work. Well, that went a whole lot easier than I thought, so I figured I'd pause here just to give you a few pointers and tips. So, as you can see, I left that bolt in there, and I actually could have left the other bolt in because this intake, you can see, is slotted for those left side bolts. Also uses kind of an O-ring for a seal on each side, so the reality is this actually comes out pretty simply. The bolts are kind of tight to get at, and according to the manual, Harley Davidson sells a special tool. Not surprising, and I'm sure it's pretty expensive. I was able to just use a standard Allen key, and that fit in there. Took a little bit of work, but it worked out just fine. It looked like I might have had to pull out the cylinder temperature sensor over there. That looked like it was a 13/16 size socket. The socket's a little bit long, so I think what I'm probably going to do, if you wanted to take it out with it in place for this deep well socket I had, I was probably going to have to shorten it a bit using my grinder. But I think what I'm probably going to do is just plan to take that sensor out and put it into the new cylinder before I install the thing on the bike. So with that, next step I'm going to have is going to be taking off this mount, and then we should be ready to start pulling the cylinders. I wanted to pause for a minute here to kind of just talk about where I am and a couple of parts of the setup that I forgot to do. So I've got the motorcycle on my motorcycle jack right now. The reason that I have this, reason I'm doing this is because it's time for me to take the rocker supports off. And per the manual, to do that, you need to have the cylinder that you're working on in the top dead center position with both of the valves closed. That would be the point when the spark plug would normally be firing, or thereabouts. So there's a couple of ways that you can do it per the manual. The way that is going to ultimately be the easiest for me is to jack this up, put the transmission in 6th gear, which I've already done, and then when you do that, you can rotate the back wheel and it'll rotate the engine actually pretty easily, which makes sense if you think about the fact that how the gear ratios work and all that. So, so I'm about to go do that, and once I have that done, I'll be able to take the rocker supports off for whichever cylinder I do first and then the following cylinder. No real notes for getting the rocker covers off. That's pretty straightforward. Harley puts in the manual a specified untorquing sequence. I've never heard of that before. I did that for loosening them, but I'm not really convinced it was truly required. Yep, I think I'm ready to just keep on going. Figured I'd pause for a second here and kind of talk about where we are. So at this point, the rear cylinder is basically completely disassembled. I got the cover, I got the bolts for the breather that sits in the middle of the rocker support, the 4 bolts for the rocker support, got that whole assembly out. Then there's 6 bolts that hold this rocker box surround area, get that off. After that, there's the 4 bolts that hold the cylinder head to the cylinder and then also hold the cylinder to the crankcase. And I guess I got a little bit out of order there because before I got to that part, I got the pushrod tubes removed, got the pushrods removed, got the lifters removed. All of that's pretty straightforward. Let me just bring the phone here a little bit closer so that you can see. Actually, before I do that, I'm just going to show you removing the cylinder. So removing the cylinder, actually pretty simple. One thing I'll say is that I've got this small dead blow hammer here. Sometimes after these things have been sitting for a while, they just need a little bit of a tap. These dead blow hammers are great because they're surrounded by plastic and you've got the material on the inside. That's why they rattle when you shake them. And they're good for just a nice little tap that'll loosen things up without damaging them. The cylinder head actually just came right off. I didn't have to tap it at all. I went to go tap it and just pretty much fell right off. It was torqued down properly and everything, so there's no indication that it was leaking, just that it came apart nicely. Once the cylinder head's off, you can basically just rock the cylinder out. And I'm going to try doing it this way. Maybe a little unconventional, but and just comes out nice and easy. Not bad at all. So, all right, so let me put this down and bring the phone over and kind of show you a few things. All right, so the first thing I'm going to say is that the rear cylinder, you definitely have less access than the front cylinder. This is commonly known. Everything is still accessible, I found, with standard tools, but you might have to get a little bit creative in terms of using, say, a short socket. For the 2 rear bolts that hold this rocker box surround on, I had to start off with a short socket and then finish them off with a wrench coming from a different angle. So nothing, really nothing too bad. Just you know, sometimes when you got a tight spot, you need multiple tools to get the job done. But like I was saying, so I started off by taking these 2 bolts off for this breather. So each cylinder has a breather that just lets the crankcase vents go through the intake. Then it's these 4 bolts that hold the rocker assembly on. You can see what the rocker assembly looks like over there.
I find this pretty interesting personally, just because I'm used to standard pushrod engines that don't have rockers shaped like this. The rockers are normally just pivoting on a part front to back. Here you kind of got the shaft pivoting as well. So pretty neat design. Once that's done, like I was saying, you got 6 bolts that hold this cover on, and then once that pops off, you then get access to the 4 bolts. You can kind of see that there's holes for 4 bolts that hold the head and the cylinder on. But let's take a look at how my engine looks now that we've gotten this part taken apart. So remember, I'm going to be reusing the stock heads, and these valves are looking really good. The exhaust valve just has a nice pattern to it, not showing any signs of being burned or anything, which is good. Intake valve looks good as well. Looking at the cylinder, you can see it still has cross hatching on it, which, seeing as the bike only has 10,000 miles on it, that's not surprising at all. But the cylinder looks like it's in good shape. Piston also looks pretty good. I'd say on the whole, you got a bit of a carbon buildup on there, but you expect that. Maybe even a little bit more carbon buildup than I would expect, given how lean the engine was running and its configuration. And looking inside the engine, I don't see any signs of rust or anything. It looks like everything's in pretty good condition. So now that I've got this cylinder off, I'm going to go ahead and just repeat the process for the front cylinder. Remember, now what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to rotate the engine to make sure that the forward piston now is at top dead center and that both of the valves are closed before I get started. So I'm going to have to go through that process again. And while doing that, even though I'm not going to be reusing these pistons, it's a good idea to just make sure that you're holding the piston so that it's not contacting those studs while you're doing it, just to make sure you don't get anything in the engine or damage the pistons, because who knows, maybe I'll want to keep these for some reason and reuse them someday. So let's rotate the engine around and get the front part off. Alright, so as you can see, I've got both of the cylinders off completely now, and I've also got the cam cover off. Getting ready to take off the cam tensioner here, and then take off the cam sprockets. Now, Harley Davidson sells a cam locking tool, which I do not have, that basically just goes right between the teeth here to try to lock it. One other tip that I saw that I think I'm going to try is just leaving the bike in gear and then holding the rear brake with my foot while I'm trying to loosen the sprockets. That seems like it ought to work, and kind of similar to what I do on cars sometimes. One thing that I hadn't noted before, when you're taking all the stuff apart, it's good to have some sort of a system to try to make sure that you keep track of everything and keep track of which cylinder it was on, the front or the rear, and where it was located specifically. A lot of these parts you're not going to be reusing on this kit. For example, the kit came with new push rods, and I think it also had new lifters in it. But it's always a good idea just to keep everything organized, because some of it you're going to need to use and some of it you may not. The stuff that you don't need to reuse, you may want to keep for some other reason. So I just always like to keep things laid out. It doesn't look particularly neat over there, but it is organized enough so that I know where things are. So let's go ahead and try to get this off and see if we can't get completely disassembled. Figured I'd move the camera over here to maybe get a better view of where things are and kind of talk about the current status. So we're just about 100% apart. I found out that I'm not going to be able to complete the project today. Important tool that I'm missing is these inner cam bearings. Need to have a special removal and installation tool that I don't have, so I need to order that to get them out. If you look on the forums, there's some debate about whether or not you need to replace them. The thing I'll say is that when you take a look at
the new bearings, and I don't want to take it out because I'm not ready to install. But if you look, you can see that these new bearings are basically 100% rollers. You have rollers the entire way around. And if you take a look at these stock Harley bearings that are in there, they have a cage and you've only got about half the number of rollers. So it's pretty obvious that the new ones are going to be a better, stronger design, just based off of that. Now, I talked to Joe at Powerhouse Dyno about this to get his input. He did the initial dyno run, and he's going to be helping out with the final dyno tune. And he said that he always replaces them, that he's seen them fail quite a lot. Another tip that he gave me that I'm about to do is he said he would recommend rotating the crankshaft with the transmission in neutral a number of times, and as you're rotating it, make sure that these rod bearings are still loose. That he's seen some issues where sometimes the rod bearings will go bad, and that's the easiest way to tell. And of course, if they are bad, now is the best time to replace them because I've already got the bike torn down. Only got 10,000 miles on it, and I've taken good care of it, so hopefully that's not the case. But so my plan for now, since I'm not going to be able to get those cam bearings replaced, and therefore I'm not going to get the cams installed, what I'd still like to do is, assuming that these bearings are good, which hopefully they will be, I don't see why they wouldn't, I'm going to take the pistons off, check the ring gaps for the new rings, put those new rings on the new pistons, put the pistons in the cylinders. Joe gave me another tip on that, and I'll show you what I'm going to do there when I get to it. And then try to get the cylinders and the heads on and torqued on. And if you think about it, that's something that we can do just fine without doing anything with the cams. It's not going to get in the way at all. So at least we'll be able to get part of the way back together, even if we can't get the full way back together. And we'll see. Let's get back to work. All right, I figured that I'd just kind of do a little video here to show what I was talking about with checking these rod bearings. So you can see these are really loose, which is exactly how they're supposed to be. These are roller bearings, so they should never be tight. They should never hang up. And so what Joe said he would do is just basically rotate the crankshaft around. Make sure that you're being careful with that you're not going to nick the crankcase when you do this. And just keep on making sure that you're not seeing any kind of wear spots. And you have to do this a bunch of times because since these are roller bearings, every time that you stop, the rollers are going to end up in a different position. So you don't just do it at one spot. The rollers could have flat spots somewhere. And if you don't try this in a bunch of positions, you might be missing where you've got a wear spot. Realistically, these seem like they're in pretty good shape. I'm going to do it a few more times just to make sure that it's all looking good, but I think we're probably in a good spot to take these pistons off and start getting set up with getting the new pistons ready to put on.